The now empty Eastern State Penitentiary is a haunting relic looming over the city's skyline as a grim testament to America's past. Within these walls, the state employed such peculiar and harrowing methods of punishment that I wouldn't even be allowed to describe them on YouTube. And yet, surprisingly, this formidable institution was once considered a pioneer in reform. The history runs deep here, from Al Capone's designer cell to forgotten escape tunnels. So join us to find out what remains. This is the story of the Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. When Eastern State Penitentiary was constructed, it was one of the most expensive prisons ever made, with a price around $780,000, and is considered to be the first modern prison. The design of the penitentiary was decided by competition, with multiple architects submitting designs to be considered. In the end, John Haviland's won out. He was a British architect who had settled in Philadelphia and beat his rival, William Strickland, winning the $100 prize in the process. Construction began in 1821, and Strickland was chosen to oversee the project, but fired just a year later and replaced by his competitor. When Eastern State was conceived, solitary confinement didn't really exist as a concept. It hadn't been instituted in most prisons before, so this would be the first time to institute it in full force. The idea was to make prisoners feel truly alone, in order to repent for their crimes. To this end, the prison was designated with 250 prisoners in mind, each with their own cell for the entirety of their sentence. The entrance to each cell was a small door that forced prisoners to bow when entering or exiting the cell, as if to a higher power, encouraging a penitent attitude. This was reinforced by vaulted ceilings and skylights, which the architect claimed let God's light and wisdom shine down upon them. To prevent inmates from seeing guards or other prisoners, cells had so-called feed doors and personal exercise yards. And in a time when even the White House had no indoor plumbing, Eastern State had faucets and flushing toilets. The penitentiary had no cooling system, but in the winter, hot water was piped through the prison to provide brief relief from the cold. The prison was designed in a wagon wheel layout. 7 single-story cell blocks extended circularly around a central point, giving guards a clear line of sight virtually anywhere in the prison at any time. 2 cell blocks were completed before Eastern State opened in 1829, less than a week shy of Halloween. In 1831, Cell Block 3, the last of the original single-story cell blocks, was completed. From this point forward, cell blocks were built with 2 stories or more, as more and more people were incarcerated there. Cell blocks 4 through 7 were all built with 2 stories and were completed in 1835. In all, the prison covers 11 acres with 450 heated cells, not to mention state-of-the-art plumbing and sewage systems. It was a technological and architectural marvel, but even after the prison's creation, all was not well. In 1877, 4 new cell blocks needed to be built, this time without exercise yards, since they utilized space between existing cell blocks. However, after this, yet more space was needed. In 1911, cell block 12 was built between cell blocks 6 and 7, made of reinforced concrete and having 3 stories with 40 cells each. 12 had no arched ceilings or skylights, only narrow windows in each cell. Cell Block 13 was opened between 1909 and 1926. Little is known about its early use, but one fact is clear. This was the block where most punishments were dealt. Known as the Hole, or the Klondike, it housed 10 dark, poorly ventilated cells with iron beds and barely enough room to breathe. Cells were about half the size of those found in normal prisons, often limiting the ability to stand, treatment that would constitute extreme cruelty by today's standards. The last block built was Cell Block 14 in 1926, a 3-story building that completely eliminated the last of the spaces between any other blocks. And it needs to be pointed out that a prison meant to hold 250 prisoners, was now packed with 1,700, putting prisoners in a precarious situation, to say the least. Throughout the years, the compound saw many changes. On top of, or rather inside, new cell blocks, staff and prisoners alike have modified the facility to their needs. One of the first changes to Eastern State was Warden Michael Cassidy's impressive office space. He built the office for his work in the 1880s, but later wardens moved their offices into the administration building. This gave way for the religious staff, the Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic chaplains to move in. Another religious space constructed in the penitentiary was the Eastern State Synagogue, perhaps the first of its kind in an American prison. Built in 1924, the synagogue featured dark wooden benches, an arc reader's table, an ornate plaster Star of David, and an eternal flame. It remained a staple of Eastern State's religious community for the duration of the prison's use. You would almost think that the penitentiary, with its spiritual outlook and divinity-inspired architecture, would be effective in reforming its prisoners with religion. Well, in 1955, one prisoner actually was. Lester Smith, who had been convicted of multiple armed robberies, converted to Catholicism while in prison. With the Bible being the only book available, he read the scripture and painted, which was a hobby that he had taught himself, using the signature Paul Martin to honor his two favorite saints. One day, the penitentiary's Catholic chaplain, Father Edwin Geller, saw him painting in his cell and invited him to decorate the offices where the priest met and counseled prisoners. Smith accepted, and in 1955, he had painted 23 murals, each with beautiful, vulnerable art. The most striking mural is named The Penitent Prisoner, which depicts a kneeling prisoner seeking forgiveness from God. Smith's paintings set apart the Catholic chaplain's room from others and are testaments to someone who underwent a powerful change while in prison. So, how did this prison, which inspired hundreds across the globe, ultimately fall apart? Well, the answer lies in Eastern State's creation. The Pennsylvania prison system, also known as the separate system, became too costly to maintain. It required prisoners to feel completely isolated from the moment they walked in. Each prisoner had their own cell, their own exercise yard, food had to be delivered individually through feed doors, and exercise times had to be carefully scheduled to prevent neighboring inmates from interacting with one another. Critics also protested against the negative effects of solitary confinement, which we now know were worse than they could have ever imagined. Within the prison, prisoners weren't just isolated. It felt as if no one else even existed. They did everything alone, from eating to bathing. And in the process, they weren't even allowed to speak to themselves. They were drowning in utter silence, with guards wearing felt covers on their shoes to reduce the noise they made. And when they did leave the cell, a hood was frequently put over their head so they couldn't see any other human being. It was psychological torture at its finest. Although it could be argued that the Philadelphia Society meant well, modern science tells us that the use of solitary confinement is one of the worst possible punishments that they could carry out. Humans are social creatures, and it's widely agreed that we have a fundamental need for connection. Even as far back as 50 years ago, research linked social isolation and sensory deprivation with slowed brain activity. Even just 1 week in solitary could lead to significant changes in the brain, resulting in damage to learning, memory, and awareness, qualities that were most often just exchanged for highlighted anxiety and fear. Research also shows that social deprivation can cause people to experience social pain, which the brain processes the same way as physical pain. And with that in mind, if prisoners had existing mental illnesses, which they are likely to have had, then solitary confinement only made them worse. In fact, it can also lead to prisoners developing new mental illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, insomnia, PTSD, paranoia, and psychosis. Prisoners in solitary confinement are 3 times more likely to have hypertension, 3 times more likely to hurt themselves, and 5 times more likely to end their lives. So, for many valid reasons, the Pennsylvania system was abandoned. In its place came the Auburn system, which was inspired by the Philadelphia Society. Originating in 1819 in Auburn, New York, this system had prisoners eat and work together, but not speak during these activities. The system also believed the prisoners had the potential to corrupt each other if they had too much contact, so they were held in solitary confinement cells at night. But with the loss of one punishment came the rise of many others. Whenever a prisoner stepped out of line or even spoke, they were met with lashing by a leather strap, the water bath, the hole, or the mad chair. The lashings are self-explanatory, and we've already covered the hole, also known as the Klondikes, but the other punishments require a little more detail. The water bath involved dunking a prisoner in ice-cold bath water and then hanging them out to dry overnight. The cruelest guards would save this punishment for the winter when the water froze on the prisoner's skin. For the mad chair, prisoners were tightly strapped to a chair for hours or sometimes days before being released. Their movement and circulation was restricted for so long that prisoners spent days recovering from the punishment, often unable to walk. Some prisoners even lost their limbs to amputation when the circulation didn't return. With that being said, Eastern State Penitentiary was a truly awful place, with many prisoners ending their lives to escape punishment in one form or another. And it's no wonder that the Pennsylvania legislature recommended abandoning the penitentiary in 1945, followed by investigations lasting until 1959. But what happened next all but sealed the prison's fate. In 1961, John Clausenberg tricked a guard into opening the cell of another prisoner, Manuel Magendral. Together, they overpowered the guard and started the largest riot in the prison's history. Several hours later, a large force of policemen, guards, and state troopers were assembled to reclaim the prison. They regained control, but the riots fueled more discussion about Eastern State's closure. Almost as if to sign a death warrant, the federal government designated the penitentiary a National Historic Landmark in 1965, before it finally closed down permanently just 5 years later. After Eastern State Penitentiary closed and all the remaining prisoners had been moved out, the city of Philadelphia purchased the building for $400,000. They thought it could be renovated and transformed into anything from an apartment complex to a mall, but instead it sat and collected dust for decades. Hence, the Philadelphia Streets Department used the penitentiary grounds for storage, and the last city caretaker, Dan McLeod, fed the colony of stray cats that took up residence in the empty halls. Vandals smashed skylights and windows while an urban forest grew in its halls and cells. It wasn't until 1988 that the Eastern State Task Force was formed, made up of architects, preservationists, and historians. They convinced the city to preserve the prison, rather than turn it into something else. Mayor Wilson Goode urged the Redevelopment Authority to reject all proposals for commercial use of the property, and limited tours started later that year. At first, tourists needed to wear hard hats to tour the crumbling prison, but after extensive stabilization efforts that began in 1991, tourists no longer needed one. The first of its popular Halloween fundraisers also started this year, allowing visitors to tour the prison as a haunted house. The Terror Behind the Walls event had been held every year since. Other than Halloween, it has special events year-round, such as the Winter Adventure Tours, prison uprisings, and Bastille Day celebrations. The Philadelphia Society, which created Eastern State and in turn the modern prison, survives today as the Pennsylvania Prison Society, promoting correctional reform and social justice. Over its dreadful years as a prison, Eastern State has built up a reputation of being one of the most haunted places in the country. Hauntings, spiritual encounters, and sightings are all a part of this prison's folklore. One of the most well-known stories comes from a locksmith who was hired to remove part of cell block 14. While removing a lock, he was overcome by a sudden feeling of dread as the faces of agonizing prisoners lined the walls. Another commonly reported sighting is that of giggling coming from the prison cells. Even Al Capone felt something was amiss, complaining about being haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims of the Valentine's Day Massacre he was a part of. The penitentiary has been featured on the Travel Channel's Most Haunted Live, Fox's World's Scariest Places, MTV's Fear, and Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters. Footage captured in Cell Block 12 from Ghost Hunters may be the most controversial ghost sighting in history. Which I suppose brings us full circle. So until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.